Shall I go? Thank you for being here on the last day. So as we suggested, based on your votes, this is going to be a 3-part lecture because you are too evenly balanced among topics. And what we're going to do is I'm going to kick off with a little bit about big data. Ben's going to do a little bit about One Health, and then we will try and build a model together. And so the big data example I thought I'd give you is one from my own work. And this is where we can use mobile phone call data records to track human mobility. And it should be obvious that human mobility drives infectious disease dynamics, right? If nobody with measles ever left their house, we would not have a problem with measles spread. But the way we can schematize this is you can imagine every time a person moves, we'd like to know what's going on. If this individual starts at location 5, moves to location 4, then 3, 2, and 1 with maybe some back tracing, we can get to grips with this by looking at where they made calls. So every time you make a call, it goes through the closest tower to you. And the mobile phone operators have that information. So if we know where the towers are, if we have a map of the towers, we can get at fluxes of human movement. So at this point in time, you should be screaming like there are huge issues with anonymity, like what the hell are you doing, Jess? Good point. And the way we do this is usually, so we have data from many countries. We've worked with many countries on this sort of data. And what needs to happen is the mobile phone operator has to be on board, obviously. The regulators in the country have to be on board. And then generally, someone like the Ministry of Health has to say, we think this is a good idea. So that has to happen first. The next thing that usually happens is that we send one of our postdocs or technicians to sit in the operator in the country to aggregate the data. And this data, I mean, this really is big data, right? Like if you think about how many mobile phone calls are made every day, this is an amount of data it would actually be hard to walk out of the building with. And so what usually happens is we aggregate it. So we figure out fluxes between different towers on the scale of weeks, on the scale of months, at different, whatever the scale that seems sensible is. So no personal information ever leaves the operator. Of course, it's still creepy that the operator has all that information, but that's the world we live in. So with that in hand, you can see that if we know these different towers, we can figure out on day 1, this person was making calls at tower 5. On day 2, probably also at tower 5. And then they maybe move to tower 4, and maybe there's some movement between them. So there's ways in which you have to take this very fine-scale data with both fine-scale and with missing pieces, because if someone doesn't make a call for 3 days but travels all across the country, you don't have that information. So there's certainly uncertainty in this data at that scale. It might be good enough for purpose, right? So we can build a pattern of where people are predominantly on every day for which we have data, and then we can figure out from this the days on which they moved. So this is one set of issues, right? One set of ways in which we need to decide how much uncertainty, how much missing movements are in that pattern. The other obvious source of bias here is that who owns mobile phones, right? It's probably, and there are some cultures and settings where it's only men. Is it relevant to only have the movement of men? In many cultures, small children will not carry phones so much, but that might not matter so much because they usually travel with their parents. But it might be a socioeconomic issue, in which case, is it relevant to capture just the movement of the rich people? Maybe not. You have to keep all this in mind, but it still gives us this incredible window onto, it's sort of like natural history of humans, right? It's human ecology in a really fascinating way. And you can start thinking about how it might relate to patterns of disease flow. So we've done this, for example, in Madagascar. This shows you a map of Madagascar, and these are the major fluxes between different districts based on the mobile phone network that we put together using call data records, this is that acronym, from the mobile phone operator Orange. So 2015 data from Orange, this is what we put together. And we were interested at that time in the question of the flow of malaria. This is something that Ben knows much more about than I do, but I will still give an attempt to discuss this. And so the way malaria works in Madagascar is the high plateau, which is in the center, tends to have very little malaria because it's quite high, there's not that many mosquitoes. It's also the place where there's easy access to drugs, where people are more likely to have bed nets if they are exposed to malaria. So very little malaria here, a lot more malaria along the coasts, but quite patchy as well. So we were interested in sort of getting a sense of what the pattern of introduction of malaria from the coast to the capital might be, because this was something that was happening, and whether the mobile phone data could give us a sense of what this was. And we were basing this work on analyses that had happened in Kenya, where people had shown that Nairobi, the capital, was at risk, was experiencing introductions of malaria that all came from one place, that all came from the banks of Lake Victoria, basically. And that meant you had a very simple strategy for really blocking off that flow of malaria, which was to up your control in this one location. Okay? So we were interested to know whether this burden in the capital was actually coming from one place. And to do this, we put together a map of where the parasites are. This was based on a Malaria Atlas project, which is one of those estimation games that exists. And then we can put that together with how people are traveling to figure out what the sources of travel are, so where people are leaving from, to the sinks of travel, so where people are going to. First for travel, and then for the parasites themselves. So you can see that the parasites are starting off here mostly, and are mostly going here. This is not shocking. People always go to the capital city more than they go anywhere else. But it might be obvious to you, this is a very complicated pattern. And if you were to look at two different districts, so this square or this square, they were net exporters of malaria, but it was kind of going all over the place. Although there's a general pattern that the capital city is getting more introductions than anywhere else, there's no clear pattern of what the sources of for malaria in particular settings are. So there's no clear investment case to be made. This is where we need to go to stop the flow of malaria across the country. And of course, this is all indirect. We don't know at this stage whether the mobile phone data is capturing who's infected, right? Which is the thing that this is the large conceptual leap we've made as part of this work. There's a suggestion that this works. So we had really good data from the capital on where people thought they had got their malaria from. So who their contact was, where that person had come from. And if we ranked where the cases were coming from against the prevalence data, so what we would have predicted with our mobile phone data was the origin of malaria against what we saw in the capital city, which is the one place where you have that information, it works kind of, right? Like it's not perfect, but it works kind of. Reassuring, but sort of a very unsatisfying, incomplete story because there's no clear public health recommendation from it. A sense that the pattern of mobility is capturing that pattern of introductions, but not a kind of gotcha. There's another way in which we can think about, so this is the way we were thinking about mobility and this mobile phone derived mobility driving transmission is people get infected with malaria, they move to the capital city, they're bitten by a mosquito, etc. For directly transmitted infections, it's perhaps even more obvious how this might happen. And I was looking at some data on Rubella. This is Rubella in Kenya. And the really funky thing about Rubella in Kenya, this is age showing the bright red as the higher ages, is that there's 3 peaks in every year, right? And so if you were to estimate transmission, and it sort of starts off high here, and then it kind of goes down, but there are always just about 3 peaks in every year. And I just happened to be sitting in my office in Oxford at the time, when one of my colleagues from Harvard walked in and she was like, "What are you looking at?" And I was like, "Oh, it's Rubella." And she said, "That's really weird because that looks exactly like the mirror image of the mobile phone data," because she's the person who really pioneered using this data. So if you put those two things together, so this is the average transmission in every month of the year starting in June for Rubella, and you find that it's the mirror image of the overall fluxes of movement associated with mobile phone data. This is not like, again, this is not like a strong causal inference. This is a very suggestive pattern, but it is pretty suggestive, and it was consistent across the different regions, and it maps what we expect, right? When people travel, they're moving away, they're disaggregating generally, and that's when we would expect transmission for this disease, which moves from person to be low. So all of this, these two pieces are like mobile phone data can capture disease-relevant movement to some extent, and then came the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. And there was some work that Ben had led, which suggested that in these settings where people were making predictions as to what would happen in sub-Saharan Africa, based on very little data, it could take a very long time for these diseases to spread simply because they're not that well connected. And we had the opportunity to kind of go back and stare at this because a wonderful postdoc in the group, Phidi Sourazin-Bainarive, had collated all the case data from Madagascar for all the different regions over the course of 2020 and 2021. So we spent months on the calls with WHO, with Orange, with the Ministry of Health, trying to get the updated mobile phone data. Everyone said, yes, 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 we need to talk to one more committee. We never got the data, but we still had the 2015 data. So a postdoc called Tanzana used that data, it's the best that we had, to try and figure out whether we could have anticipated how SARS-CoV-2 spread across Madagascar. So we were really, we were trying desperately hard to get this data at the start of the pandemic because we thought then Madagascar could say, okay, it's going to this region next, we've got to send the vaccines, we've got to be ready with the masks, the thermometers, the care. We didn't manage to get it in time, but we could at least see how well, retrospectively, we could have done. And so Tanzana compared a bunch of different models, so a null model where there's equal probability of travel between all regions. Euclidean distance, this is something called a gravity model, which is frequently used in our field, where you assume that people move more to bigger places, and their movement between places is reduced by the distance between the places. So it's sort of just a ratio of size divided by distance. We used Euclidean distance, or we used transit time, and this is where Tanzana went out and talked to all the bus drivers and said, how long does it take to get from here to there? The Malaria Atlas project has these estimates of friction, which it's big machine model, where they pull together satellite images and knowledge of roads and all these sorts of things to try and figure out what they think trajectories should be, and they work reasonably well in some settings. And then finally, we use the mobile phone data. And to capture this, I forget who was asking about stochastic models. Should I close the door? It's probably hot. Okay. They might be almost gone. It's a cow. They're gone. So obviously, to figure out what's happening, we're going to need to, it's very reasonable to assume that SARS-CoV-2 would arrive in the capital. Madagascar's an island. But then, no matter what the connectivity matrix, a number of different things could have happened. So we did stochastic simulations. Someone was asking about stochastic simulations. We did stochastic simulations of travel across the regions using all these different matrices and compared them to the data. Okay? Obvious thing to do. I don't know. No, so it is, you can look this up. I can send you the link. It is an effort that the Malaria Atlas project has provided. They have them for all countries in the world. And what they do is they use, it is a little bit of a black magic, black box of machine learning, where they use satellite images, they use road networks, they use travel time, and they ground truth it using some existing data. And they come up with how long it would take to travel between all pairs of points, pretty much across the globe. So the reason I can't tell you the exact method is because the exact method is, mathemagic. But it is available if anyone wants to use it. And one of my graduate students, Malavika Rajiv, we need this kind of information all the time. And she was working before we had the Orange data. And she ground truthed some of it, right? So she used whatever the estimate they had for travel between different cities, and she both talked to bus drivers and drove it herself, and So there is some distribution, but there is a broad correlation between what we see. Okay, good. And the answer, the punchline is, everything's crap. Nothing works, right? These are all the different models, and this is correlation with the timing of the first case in the stochastic simulation versus the fifth case, because we thought, reporting might be poor. You might not catch that first case very well. Maybe you'd be better at the fifth case. But they all have this pretty, they're not, no one of these models is spectacularly better than the other. And none of them are great. They're all less than 80%. So the conclusion here is really much the title of the paper, which is that it was just terrible. We're just not very good at this. Which, obviously it would be great if we were better at this. And I think this is a sort of interesting, it's interesting that in the cases where I'm sort of glad in a way we didn't get that data early and start making predictions. I think we would have made them cautiously, but you know, like it's good to know that we didn't. But you know, one of the reasons it's so hard to say what this means is that the coronavirus data was also terrible, right? It's possible that our measures of mobility were terrible, but we know that the surveillance system was working terribly as well. So as ever, I think we need a global immunological observatory. I think if we'd had a sense of, you know, who was susceptible and who wasn't, if we'd been able to look retrospectively, we would be able to go in, you know, if we'd gone in at the end of 2020 and figured out what that immune profile was, we would have had a better sense of how and when people had arrived places. So that's the big data bit. Any questions while perhaps Ben sets up? Any questions from me?
I have
yes.
Is it working? Oh.
Yeah.
What's the spatial resolution of the data? I mean, how far towers are from one another, for example?
So this is a great question. So yeah, hang on one second. So the case data was terrible, like it was at the scale of regions. This data is obviously constrained by the distribution of towers. And there are a lot of towers in Madagascar, but there are obviously lower density of towers precisely in lower income settings. So I forget exactly, I think in Madagascar, you have pretty good coverage, but not coverage here and not coverage here, which is maybe why we're also not getting good mobility patterns there, right? So you can also figure out where your black holes might be and try and correct for that. In Kenya, we know very well that all of the north of Kenya has like one tower. So, so what you're doing with that, but that's an excellent question.
And I don't know which countries have you worked with, but you go to one phone carrier, like there may be like several type of services, and that might be a bias, like, oh, this service is cheaper, this service is more expensive.
This is something we searched our souls about a lot. So in Madagascar, Orange is the more expensive carrier. What's it called? Would have been the better one, but we couldn't, like we chased the guy so much and we could never get hold of it. There is one Norwegian company that shares their data. So we have worked with Namibia and Pakistan and South Africa, which is all shared by this one Norwegian data company. So that there are settings where you have sort of consistent data across different settings. And there we found some really intriguing, fun things. So, you know, we were really looking for, this was part of a climate change grant at the time, and we were looking to see whether human mobility was driven by climate patterns. No evidence. People move according to school holidays everywhere in the world. And like the worst time we could identify for a pathogen emergence event was Christmas, because everyone just takes it home to their families. It doesn't, even in Pakistan, it was amazing. Anyway, great questions. Anyone else? All right.
Are you going to the lunch? I saw that What?
I was going to, because I was into reading this, and I thought, well, maybe if I ask about you don't mind if I go, all of you.
one more minute and then I'll get started. But is the audio okay? All right, I'll get started. And I was going to talk about One Health and allied approaches. I noted allied approaches because there's very similar concepts that get different brand names or different names associated with them. And One Health is one of the more popular, but it's among a suite of approaches that have sort of similar underlying concepts or components. And this is mostly thinking about epidemiology in the context of a changing world, or how I think about it is how can epidemiology acknowledge and be useful given that we live in a changing world? And to sort of talk about that more, now we know that the global climate is changing, local environments are being disturbed, human behavior is also changing, and how does that lead to a shift or an increase in disease burdens? And most disease systems, if not all, pathogens and non-communicable diseases, nutrition, have some climatic or environmental dependence. We can think about nutrition depends on what farmers can grow, and that depends on the environmental conditions, and I'll talk about one example there. For infectious disease, we can think about vector-borne diseases where the life cycle of the vector is in part determined by climatic or environmental conditions. And for a disturbing local environment, people often talk about deforestation, land use change, reducing the biodiversity surrounding a human population, or changing the assemblage of species, of wildlife species that live and are in contact with the human population nearby. And so one other of these allied approaches is called planetary health. And this is sort of like the world I grew up in, we called it planetary health, but people call it One Health. And there's slight differences I'll talk about later. But there's this framework from work by Sam Myers. I think this was published in The Lancet in 2017 or something like that. You can search that title and find more information and read that. I think it's a nice summary of these. And there's this one schematic that I think captures what we're going to be talking about today well. And that's, they separate things into various steps. And the first step is you have underlying drivers. So consumption, demographic shifts, population density, urbanization, things like that. Aging of the population is occurring. You have technology shifts, and I think that sort of like air travel is more common and things like that might be what they're referring to with technology. And those underlying drivers lead to ecological drivers, or sort of like more ecological concepts we can think of. This is increased consumption can lead to increased global pollution, climate change, resource scarcity, biodiversity loss, land use and land cover change. Land use change is when you convert a landscape from a natural forested landscape, for example, to a farm. And altered biogeochemical cycles, this would be sort of rising ocean temperatures play with weather patterns and lead to changes in precipitation and changes in water levels and nutrient concentrations and things like that. And all of those lead to proximate causes. And those proximate causes for health could be reductions in air quality, instabilities in food production, increases in infectious disease exposures, changes in access to fresh water, or other things that are important for human health, and sort of natural hazards. This could be migrations due to extreme weather events, cyclones, things like that can lead to direct impacts on health, and also make populations more vulnerable and more exposed to other potential risk factors for health. But of course, we can't draw a direct line. We can't say like a cyclone, the simplest example could be a cyclone in Madagascar and a cyclone or hurricane in Florida are likely to have different effects because there's mediating factors, the socioeconomic status where these things are occurring, the existing governance, amount of wealth, technology, and sort of human behavior all will mediate the pathway from an underlying driver through ecological drivers, proximate cause, and ultimately to some health effect like malnutrition or infectious disease increases, things like that. I think it's worth noting that they put mental health in here, and we often don't talk about this, but one of my colleagues from Madagascar, Hervé Rangiamadi, has recently started thinking about how declines in marine ecosystems lead to mental health effects in the fishing communities that live around those degrading habitats. And I won't talk about that today, but I think it's important that even in 2017 that was already included, and that's probably a major area for future research. In terms of changing climates and changing human behaviors and consumption, these are plots where they're just showing changes in certain economic or consumption categories from 1900 to 2000, and the common pattern is everything is skyrocketing. You could think of something like plastic production has gone from 0 to 400 million metric tons in 50 years. Energy use since 1950 has gone up fivefold. Fertilizer use has gone up exponentially. Transportation, here as a proxy, they're using the number of motor vehicles from 1960 to 2010 has just gone up 3, 4, 5-fold. I think another thing to note is that the modern world that we think of has been around for a while, but even in the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years, these things are continuing to double. And so I think like a lot of core urban areas have existed for multiple decades now, but even within this world, in the last 10 years, a lot is happening. If we just think about motor vehicles, and this last portion of the graph from the year 2000 to 2010, there's 500 million more motor vehicles just over that time frame. And these are sort of measures of human impact on natural systems. And here they have the mean percentage loss of species abundance. I am not sure where they got this data, but it's probably roughly accurate that as a proxy for terrestrial biosphere degradation, there's been this like 20, 30% loss in species abundance in terrestrial ecosystems in the last 50 years. The one I wanted to point out here is mean fish capture, where you can see that the weight in millions of metric tons of fish that's captured each year has gone up immensely since 1950. Same with tropical forest loss. There's a decent amount of tropical forest loss even before 1950, but that's continued. And maybe that's, yeah, go ahead.
The marine fish, they don't have data for the fish to...
Yeah, for some of these, they had a hard time getting historical data. World Bank and other data sources kind of like will publish yearly reports, but for example, there probably was no centralized database for fishing before the year of 1950. And this is one example of how changing global climates can have effects on human health, and something that people in this One Health, Planetary Health, Eco-Health world focus on is how increased CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere can lead to a decrease in the nutrient density of crops. This work is again led by Sam Myers, and here they experimented, they planted a bunch of rice, corn, beans, things like that, and then they covered half of the fields and pumped in more carbon dioxide. They didn't have to like physically cover it, but they had like pipes bringing in more carbon dioxide, so they grew half the crop or a random subset of the crop at a higher, experimentally higher carbon dioxide density that would mirror what we expect carbon dioxide concentrations to be in 50 years or something like that. And they found, for example, for rice, you could see that they're comparing the density of zinc, iron, protein, et cetera, in rice that was grown under normal conditions and under extra carbon dioxide conditions. And you can see that wheat has less zinc, has less iron, has less protein when it's grown at higher carbon dioxide concentrations. Rice has less zinc, less iron, less protein, et cetera. The data for corn wasn't that clear. You had these really wide confidence intervals. That sort of leads them to claiming as their title of their publication that increase in carbon dioxide threatens human nutrition. And one point that Sam Myers makes when he presents this work is that even though there's sort of like, okay, so what, rice has 5% less zinc in it, is that a huge deal? You could just eat a little bit more rice. But that's sort of like what we think of in urbanized settings where we have a lot of access to market goods. But if you're a farmer in Madagascar growing all your rice, and you're sort of maximizing your rice output, and that's barely enough to feed your family, if the amount of rice you're growing now has less nutrients nutrients, that's going to push a large proportion of the population into insufficient nutrient consumption categories. Any questions on this? I wanted to have, go ahead. I wanted to have a couple of non-infectious disease examples, but we'll get to infectious diseases as well.
The explanation for that is that they simply have more starch because of the abundance of CO2. What is the, and it becomes those nutrients become less dense in the plant. What is it?
Yeah, like the grain is more carbon and less zinc because they're just grabbing carbon from, there's a higher carbon dioxide concentration. They're fixing more carbon, and the lower, so the grain of rice is the same size but has less zinc in it.
Okay.
Yeah. I think there was some, they didn't really have the data to show it, but there was some thinking about, does the rice plant just not grow as well because it's like a novel suboptimal condition, and they didn't really have good data towards that. There's some data that shows you can get more like leaf growth and like more photosynthesis happening, but the key point is that doesn't translate to more nutrients because when you eat rice, you get enough carbs from it. And so having more carbs isn't good, but sort of like the micronutrients are super important for human nutrition. Yeah.
There is similar data for things which are not fruits, like not fruits, I mean, so something like leaves and the like, are their nutrient content affected by CO2 levels?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
That's a good question. These are all like grasses and legumes. You can think of other crops and like how they might be affected. Sure. Another non-communicable disease example is in Bangladesh and other places near the coastal margin. Sea level rise leads not just to direct flooding impacts, but also sea level enters the water that people drink, so you get increased salinity in the water available for people to drink. And there was this study published in PLOS ONE, but people frequently cite, showing that there's sea level rise around Bangladesh already occurring that leads to increased salinity of the water people are drinking. That leads to an increase in the risk of poor outcomes in pregnancy, particular preeclampsia and hypertension are tied to the concentration of salt in the water that people are drinking, in particular women. And so here's the region in Bangladesh where they worked. It's a like coastal area, there's water all around, there's more sea level intrusion, seawater intrusion into this. And so they've compared the people who are drinking or women who are drinking water that's from rain or not collected from the area, and then various other types of water that's collected in this filtered water, pond water, tube well water is going to be determined by the water in the environment, whereas like rainwater obviously isn't going to be affected by sea level rise. And they have women who are drinking rainwater and these other sources, and then they look at the odds ratio and find something like, even when they adjust for age, parity, socioeconomic status, nutritional status, et cetera, they find that odds go up 5 or 8 times of having preeclampsia if women are drinking water from these saltwater intruded water sources. Questions on that? And I wanted to get to an infectious disease example that's not malaria because I only discuss malaria often. So this is a schistosomiasis in Senegal and work led by Susanna Sokolo, who's at Stanford, where they looked at how environmental disturbance led to increased infectious disease exposure. And in this case, damming of rivers disrupts the local ecology, and you get an increase in schistosoma transmission. Schistosoma is a parasite that, in this case, it affects the bladder, and is quite common in these areas. This is an article they published in PNAS that you could check out. I think it's a really good example of sort of not just having these stories that connect an environmental disturbance to a human health outcome, but they really trace it through and experimentally modify the environment. And in this case, they restore the environment and show that has a positive effect on health. So up here on panel A, this is somebody holding this freshwater prawn. Prawn is like a freshwater shrimp or a small lobster. Presumably they have some of these in Brazil and in these areas. People eat them a lot, but they also are useful and they have like an ecosystem function and the ecosystem service they provide. They eat snails. And here they're showing snails that are captured, and it's gonna be hard to see with this lighting, but you can check the slides out later. There's little indents or breaks in these snail shells, and that's because the prawns have strong claws, and they break open those snails and eat them. And these snails are the intermediate host for schistosoma parasites. So a parasite lives in the bladder of the host. The host urinates, eggs from the parasite enter the water, and then they go find various intermediate hosts and end up in a snail. And from the snail, they shed Stochastic or larvae that will then dig through your foot, pass through your bloodstream to your lungs. You cough them up, they get into your intestinal system and make their way to the bladder. And here, this is sort of how exposure could happen. You have children playing in these freshwater systems. And the key note is that these prawns, they live in freshwater systems, but for their reproduction, they migrate down to the seashore, to the edge of the ocean. There they reproduce, and then the young prawns will migrate back up the river. So in Senegal, they have the Senegal River, and they decided to build a dam across it, so that blocked the river, so the prawns can't go downstream to reproduce. The prawn population dies off, and the snail population explodes. And they show data showing how the snail population increases in the absence of prawns. And so what they did is they rear the prawns and then reintroduce them back as juveniles. This is an adult here, but they reintroduce them back as juveniles. And then the prawns eat the snails, so there's fewer intermediate hosts for the parasite, and you would expect a decrease in the prevalence of pathogen as a result. And their data shows that to some extent. So here they have intervention sites and they have control sites. They have sites where they've added the prawns back, and they have sites that they've just let go as they were before. And they measure the prevalence of infection in humans, the frequency of heavy infection, which they define as more than 50 parasite eggs per 10 milliliters of urine. And for a lot of these parasite infections, whether you're infected or not, is one important variable, but also the density or abundance or the heaviness of the infection will determine how sick the child or host is. And as you can see, comparing the control sites to the intervention sites, there's a sort of at baseline versus follow-up, there's a decrease in prevalence that varies depending on which indicator they're using, whereas in the control sites, prevalence went up. And so they counter that pattern and they use that as evidence saying that adding the prawns back results in a decrease in the density of the intermediate host, and then they could detect that signal with some degree of confidence in the human population. That prawns, now they're controlling parasites by adding prawns, and this is sort of like a classic One Health story where like improving the health or returning an ecosystem back to its pre-disturbed state can have positive human health effects. And while I think that's good evidence, and people often want this to be true, and we are like pro-conservation, and we want to improve the quality of environments, there's not many studies that have this very clear database, very strong data suggesting or observing the human benefits to doing that. So this is a classic study that I thought was interesting. Yeah? Questions on the prawn study?
The only thing I thought was that it's unexpected to me that their life cycle, in their life cycle, they would reproduce downstream, going downstream, because I always think of those animals which go upstream to reproduce and then come back to the sea, like salmon and the like. So is it common for the river ecosystems for animals to go downstream to reproduce in the sea and then come back upstream?
I think it is. Not an expert on freshwater ecology at all, but I think it is because they do have a lot of evidence that when you build dams, for example, in the US, they've dammed almost every river, and a lot of these aquatic animals, freshwater systems just collapse. And I think that's because there's some fish, like sturgeon, do this as well. Yeah, I'm not sure how common it is for crustaceans and things like that, but it definitely is a movement between freshwater and the coastal margin does seem important. And so just to conclude this portion, I showed some data about how changing global climate can affect human health using non-communicable examples, and how disturbing local environments undoing disturbance to local environments can have an epidemiological or public health benefit, at least in the Senegal River freshwater prawn system. and showed some data about how human behavior has changed, but is accelerating in its pace of change in the previous decades. Next, I just wanted to talk about these various concepts that people use and just sort of get a sense of how familiar students are with them and if there's any guesses as to what separates these different concepts that are used. Again, they're all under the same umbrella of understanding how changing environments leads to changes in public health. But for example, how many people have heard of One Health before? Was this a concept brought up in lecture or in Twitter or in readings? A handful. Planetary Health, probably less so. It's a little bit more niche. EcoHealth. And from the name, there's no real apparent difference, right? Like these are all sort of like similar names for a similar concept. When you're reading the literature or when you're interested in these topics, there are sort of like specific differences. The type of researchers that they bring in and that use these brand names does differ a little bit. So I just wanted to talk about that so that people are aware and have that reference for future reading you may do. And just between us, if you use these terms, a lot more grants become available because they're like hot terms. So I think if you do epidemiology and you have a way to call it Planetary Health or One Health or EcoHealth, suddenly it's more popular. But yeah. Anyway, the underlying principles and the quality of the data is going to determine everything. But just keep that in mind. There's actually a paper on this which I suggest not reading because it goes into a lot of detail about a somewhat esoteric, arbitrary, or very academic debate, which is like there's these so-called holistic approaches to health. How do they differ? Is there useful information when we dissect those, that appears when we dissect those differences? And the paper has this quote that all of these fields, I'll read the quote, all promote the underlying assumption that humans and other animals sharing the same planet and the same environmental challenges, they share those same challenges, and infectious and infectious agents come into play because of that. And that might affect physical as well as mental health. So the authors point out that they all of these fields promote the same underlying assumption, but they approach it in different ways. And you can think about separating them based on the scientific areas of focus that they lean on most heavily, and if they differ in their core values. So we have these three related fields, and they overlap often, but there's minor but important differences that separate the three concepts. I think one of them is that One Health is often associated with veterinarians. You could summarize it in one sentence, that healthy animals and healthy environments lead to healthy people. And so bringing in wildlife veterinarians and things like that, people who focus on the health of non-human animals is key in this One Health approach. Especially you could think of zoonoses or things like that, or pathogens that are transmitted between domestic animals and humans. Planetary Health kind of has as its core this idea that if you minimize human disturbance, you achieve optimal health for the planet. And so this would bring in climate scientists, some notions of equity, and sort of epidemiologists. So like a classic planetary health study would show some large-scale human disturbance to the environment results in some suboptimal health status for a population. And last, EcoHealth sort of focuses on this idea that preserving biodiversity is a means to improving public health. And so conservation biologists will often use this term. So don't clear this forest because that's going to have negative consequences for the surrounding human population. And I think there's a lot of reasons to not clear a forest, and if we can show it's connected to epidemiological consequences, that gives us more ammo when we discuss with policymakers. That you have to nail down the data and you have to have a valid story, and you can't just sort of wishfully think that better preservation magically results in curing of human illness or something like that. I think that's the last slide I have. So I wanted to conclude there. Questions on One Health, Planetary Health, EcoHealth, how to get grants using these terms?
You say that One Health has a more anthropocentric view. Why don't you know, more focused on humans?
Maybe Planetary Health. One Health is like focused on animals most, I think.
It's because the equations like equal to healthy people, so it's
Yeah, I guess all sort of have a main objective for the health of humans. Some One Health stuff does focus on diseases that don't have like a large burden in human populations, is why I was hesitant to say that. Some pathogens that are really bad for wildlife, people will study, and if it infects a human, then now you're in this One Health space and you can get more grants. But I think this is, maybe healthy animals is all of them focus on the health of humans, but I would say One Health often involves research on the health of animals as a core focus. There's probably people within the field of One Health that would argue with me on that point. Definitely.
Hi. Do you have any organization that already uses these kind of terms, like, I don't know, Greenpeace, ONU, maybe something like that?
Yeah, the Lancet just started a journal called like Lancet Planetary Health. And so if you're doing work that involves these things, you now have a journal. They're often hungry for articles. And they have a Planetary Health Commission. I think they published a book. The Lancet's one, for those who are not familiar, the Lancet is one of the top 2 epidemiology biomedical journals, along with the New England Journal of Medicine. EcoHealth, there's the EcoHealth Alliance. And there's, I think it's based in New York. DASAC is yeah. And so they use that name directly in the name. And they're like a fairly well-funded and active research program that thinks a lot about the emergence of new viruses and things like that. One Health, I can't think of an organization that has One Health in their name, but I know like some grants will specifically mention that term now. Cool. We could take a quick break before we build a model. 10 minutes. 10-minute break. And so we'll come back at 12:30 and then we'll build a model until lunch.
Okay. We were told the brakes were the best part, so we went hard on the brakes. So I'm going to talk to you now about how one might build an evolutionary ecological model or a model to tackle that question. And this is something I love to do. So papers I've written ask questions like, how long should maternal immunity last? We know that mothers pass on maternal antibodies to their offspring that protect the kids for the first year of life. It's kind of weird to wonder, why a year? Why not 4 years? You know, lots of things kill children for a while. Like, how can we think about the trade-offs that might bound this? Many pathogens are actually impeded by species within your microbiome. There seems like there are some situations where hosts haven't bothered to develop an immune defense against some pathogens because they have a microbiome to do it instead. The question is, when would that happen as well? I find that very fascinating. There's this whole suite of theories about how much you should invest in your immune system if you're a long-lived versus short-lived species. Again, you can think about how you can bound this. And one thing we've worked on recently is, you know, there are some microbes that mothers faithfully pass on to their offspring. If you're an aphid, every single one of your babies will have a particular bacteria species which is essential for digestion. There are others which absolutely we shouldn't. So pathogens, for example, if I'm infected with Rubella, I do not want my kids to be infected with that. These are the edge cases. Most of the microbes we know sit somewhere between the two. There's sort of incomplete vertical transmission. And since this is presumably a trait which is to some degree under host control, this is an interesting evolutionary question as well. And this is just something that delights me, our ability to take on the world and ask questions in this way. And there's a beautiful quote actually from a Brazilian scientist which I think sums this up. So this is Fritz Müller, who started off German and then moved to Brazil. And he was an unbelievable naturalist, as I'm sure you all know better than I do. He described Müllerian mimicry, he knew the butterflies, he knew the forest, and then he read Darwin's book. And he wrote in this letter, with this phrase, which I just think is beautiful. Ever since I read your book, many facts which I used to view with indifference have become quite remarkable. Others which formerly seemed meaningless oddities have acquired great significance, and thus has the countenance of all nature been transformed. And I think this is, you know, the hardest thing is actually finding the right question to ask. And I'm not sure I found a good question for us to ask together, but let's try, okay? I do think this question of the difference between innate immunity and adaptive immunity senescing is potentially one where we can make some advances. So innate immunity, this is just a very quick catch-up for those of you who don't know. You can think of it as the foot soldiers of immunity. You invest in a certain number of macrophages, they're always patrolling. They'll knock down a certain number of pathogens that can be well recognized. Adaptive immunity, much more funky. So you set up basically single cells that can recognize a vast potential range of incoming pathogens. And then if you are infected with one of those things, that particular cell will amplify and then can shrink down and sits in memory. This is kind of a system where the costs are paid up front, right? This huge machinery, this building of the particular cells, this diversity of cells, you also have to cull a bunch of them. If they recognize you, that's no good. So you can think of the different investments as being one you're just paying all the time and one which you're paying up front. And the thing that intrigues me around this is that I've told you a little bit in the first lecture about the evolution of senescence, which is that we expect our systems to be designed in a way that they start breaking at later ages. But how they break is really interesting, and what we would predict for how they break is kind of intriguing. It seems like everything that we know about human health points to inflammaging occurring more in late life. This refers to the fact that you have more chronic inflammation. You know, your immune system seems to be, if anything, ramped up in terms of innate immunity, whereas your adaptive immunity seems to be tuned down. So innate immunity just does not seem to senesce as fast as adaptive immunity. When I first introduced this idea, Zhao, I believe, asked a question which was, does this make sense at all? Because don't we just expect things to wear out anyway, right? Like adaptive immunity, you have the cells, they've got a finite lifespan. The argument, I may be paraphrasing what you said, forgive me, but the argument against this is that we know that all of these processes can last hugely variable amounts of time, right? Like our cells, like some organisms live days, mayflies a single day, some of them live hundreds of years, it doesn't feel like that lifespan is the limiting factor. If you think in terms of telomeres, right, these are the things that set the barriers on cell lifespan, just make longer ones, right? It feels like if you can achieve the miracle of development, it isn't just the thing breaking down that should be the problem. And the actual way in which senescence manifests is mutations that are in our germline, this also links to the question you were asking, that get passed on to the next generation, right? It is something that crops up that will break you at age 50, that is in your sperm or your eggs, that your kids inherit, but that doesn't manifest. That is the things that happens. It's not just the machine breaking. We assume you can design an excellent machine. Some of you may immediately be thinking, okay, then, wouldn't we expect senescence to occur synchronously in everything then, right? And this is still a bit of a mystery, right? It's probably to do with how the system works as a whole. Like our teeth wear out before anything else. And that seems like that's a serious barrier. Like, why would that be? So there's a really interesting question about how this should play out. We're not going to, if anyone's interested, I can point you to more papers on this topic. But we're not going to drill into that right now. So I'm going to lay out for you how I think we could think about this topic. And then I'm going to send you away to think about it for 15 minutes. And you can tell me what I suggested was nonsense, or you can come up with a framing. And then we'll do like 10 minutes of debriefing, and then we'll have lunch. That's my plan. So as I was thinking about it, it seemed to me that if you think about the things that anything is exposed to, there's like a bedrock of pathogens for which we can develop innate immunity, which can be recognized, right? And that probably just rains constantly down from the sky upon us. So this is, you can think of this as a mortality hazard associated with innate immunity, right? And you could maybe invest resources towards diminishing this. This is age, by the way. And it would diminish it in the same way across all ages, right? This is, let me move forward, and then you can tell me this is nonsense. Adaptive immunity is more complicated because we know that, for your immune system to learn, you first have to suffer. So in a way, so there might be a similar, I'm dividing the world very simplistically into pathogens which have conserved markers that your innate immunity will always recognize, and pathogens that are new. And the pathogens that are new inevitably will hurt you the first time you see them, but as your immune system learns, this will come down, right? Because you're learning more and more of these pathogens through time. Where this ends up, where this line ends up, presumably is a function of how much you've invested, right? This might be low investment versus high investment in adaptive immunity. How fast this happens is going to be a function of how diverse the pathogen community is, okay? Because if there's like a whack of really diverse pathogens, you might run out of memory super fast. Whereas if there's only like 3, you could learn them all super quickly. Okay, so what we have to, so let's call this mortality hazard associated with adaptive immunity. And now what we have to do is we have to think about how a host organism is being selected to invest resources into these 2 pieces, okay? So say you start off life with a bunch of resources, and you've got to decide what fraction goes there and what fraction goes here. And if you think of this as a mortality hazard, what you want to do is maximize survivorship, say. That's a good proxy. So that's the way I would lay it out. I'm going to say get into groups of 2, 4, whatever works for you. Think about it for the next 10 minutes, 15 minutes. We'll see how we go. And then let's come back and talk about what you did. And if you fix it, that would be awesome. All right. You have a question? Any questions before we break up?
Lola, can you repeat what the y-axis in this graph would represent? It's the
mortality hazard.
Okay.
So this is how much things that you can just have encoded in your genome kill you. So you might be, this also, the height of this could vary dependent on the environment, right? You might be in something where there's a bunch of really highly conserved bacteria that if you have the innate immune receptors to defend you from, you can reduce this height, right? This is what your investment is going to do. Whereas this is mortality associated with pathogens you have to learn. And again, you're investing towards playing that out. This is just also my conceptualization of the framing. There might be better ways to do it. I'm hoping that the talent in this room is going to push us to a new level. So please. Dead silence. Groups, guys, solve the problem. Okay, sadly, I'm afraid that we should get your thoughts before the hour ends. Okay, who wants to lay out their ideas? Talis.
So we were discussing here how to invest. So we take a look about the role of the adaptive immunity, the innate immunity, and we saw from the plot that in the beginning, in the early stage of life, the adaptive immunity presents a bigger role in the mortality than the innate immunity. And we discuss when it's reasonable to start to invest in the innate immunity. So we can see that the graph from adaptive immunity decrease, and in some point in a threshold, the size of the immunity, the area of the innate immunity and adaptive immunity are equal, and from this point to the right, the area from the adaptive immunity get lower. So from this threshold, it's when it's more reasonable to invest in the innate immunity.
It's fantastic. Does anyone else have different, let's have a different group. Come on, somebody. Yes, please. Yeah.
What can I read?
Please. Don't hesitate. My writing is terrible.
So, let's see. Surviving. Okay. So we thought like this. We have two probabilities. PI is the probability of surviving when you encounter a pathogen for the first time, and it's PI because it's related to innate immunity. And we have PA, that's the probability of surviving when you encounter a pathogen for the second or third or fourth, etc. time. And it's called PA because it's associated with adaptive immunity, because you're not finding it for the first time. So we say that we have PA plus PI equals to C. Let's say that C is how much you have to spend. And you can decide to spend it on PA or PI. That's, okay. You can decide spending how much you have on PA or PI. So we need to optimize like the probability of surviving during your lifetime. So we have N pathogens, is like the pool of pathogens, the pathogens that you can eventually find during your lifetime, and you can find K of them. Let's say that you find X1, X2, and XK. These are the pathogens you find, and they can be new pathogens or pathogens that you already found. So the probability of surviving, like after encountering all these guys, first you're going to find X1, and since it's the first one, it's a new pathogen, so the probability to survive is PI. And then you're going to find X2, and the probability of surviving depends if it's a new pathogen or if it's an old pathogen, if it's X1. So we can, use a bit of mathematics, and the probability of being a new pathogen is N minus 1 over N times pi. And the probability of being an old pathogen is 1 over n times and you need to multiply by the probability of surviving. In this case, it's a known pathogen, so it's PA, and you have a term like this for every XY, and the general term, if I'm not wrong, maybe I'm wrong, we didn't have much time. This is the probability of the XI pathogen being a new pathogen. And 1 minus this is the probability of not being a new pathogen. Yes. And times PA, the probability associated with and we also can use that PA plus PI, it's a fixed amount. So we can exchange PA by C minus PI. And we can do the same here. So we have a function of PI. And then we want to maximize it. So we derive n equal to 0 and somehow find PI. I didn't have time to check, but yeah. And N and K are fixed. Yeah. PI it goes from 0 to C. So since it's a closed interval, it must have a extrema.
This is wonderful. I had not thought about it at all in this way, and this is delightful. I want to give other people a chance, but wow.
Thank you.
Someone take a picture of the board. Who next? No? No one's doing it after you. One last one? Anyone? Yeah? Sure. Oh, you already did... You guys already had a chance. Let's do somebody else. No? Julia? No? Not feeling tempted? You guys? Uvo. Ben? Nobody else? So this is very inspiring. I'll bet that whatever you guys did was really different from this, right? And I'll bet, like, this is how I was thinking about it, which I shared with this group here. And it's probably I probably sent you down one particular path, right? You were thinking about a switch at age rather than an investment up front, which is how you framed it. Fantastic, right? Who knows if this works? It looks like it could very well work. Wonderful ideas. I hope this gave you a sense of what it's like to try and probe these questions and try and think about the biology. I was thinking very much in that cumulative way, which is why my curves came out that way, but this is a very elegant, beautiful way of framing it. So the hardest thing I think well, no, I'm not sure that's true, but one of the hard things is finding a question that is amenable to this sort of reasoning and finding the interesting interstices of the world that give us where this sort of approach can be powerful. But it's something I love, so there we go. That's your last lecture. You've been wonderful. Thank you so much. And yeah, we'll see you in Germany.